All right, everybody. Welcome to part 2 in our 3-part series on rhetorical analysis. So in the previous video, if you haven't watched part 1, please go back and watch part 1 first. Otherwise, this is not going to make sense to you. All right, so in part 1, we talked about the idea of author, message or purpose, and audience. And then we talked about ethos, representing credibility, pathos, or the emotional appeal, and logos, which has to do with something acting similar to other things that it's like. Does it make logical sense for this to be acting the way that it does? So today, we're going to take a look at some different terms that can help guide you in things to look for when you're actually performing rhetorical analysis on just about anything. Kind of the dangerous but also really amazing thing about rhetorical analysis is that once you kind of get used to the idea of what it is, you start seeing it in everything. You start seeing it in politics, in commercials, in movie trailers, whatever it might be. So the first thing we're going to talk about today are audiences. So when a writer approaches, or a creator, if you're talking about some type of content like music or web content or a podcast or a movie or a book or whatever it might be, there are always two audiences that are sort of snared by that. And if you're really, really good at using the rhetorical method, then you can understand that your primary audience is what's called your intended audience. So, who is the intended audience for whatever it is you are trying to examine? So let's say that you were taking a look at an academic article that has to do with like, let's say, water table cleanliness in Louisiana. So you're writing a paper that has to do with how safe our drinking water is. So your primary audience for this, if you were writing an academic paper, would be perhaps other academics that are in the environmental field, or perhaps you're trying to address people that actually could make changes, or perhaps you're looking at a specific segment of the public that might be in danger. But whatever it is, the intended audience is your primary audience, and you are writing specifically to them. Okay? So what you're trying to do is actually write with them specifically in mind. So if you're writing to environmental scientists or city engineers that work for water departments or things like that, then you can feel free to use language that they would probably understand. For example, you might refer to things by their technical titles as opposed to layman's terms or everyday people terms for things. So the closest way that I can sort of describe this is I grew up with my dad being in the medical field, and he wouldn't ask me if I, let's say, twisted my ankle or something like that. He wouldn't ask me if I wanted a couple of Advil or Tylenol, because those are brand names. He would ask me if I wanted some ibuprofen or acetaminophen, because those are the medical terms, the scientific terms for those pharmaceutical drugs. Same way that Dad would ask if I needed a bandage or something instead of a Band-Aid. It's just part of him going to work every single day in that environment and not being able to turn it off when he came home. So there's a difference between the way that an everyday person would talk about that. Like if my boss had a headache, I'd offer him a couple of Advil or something like that. I wouldn't offer him something, based in medical jargon, because he may not understand what I'm talking about, or I may come off as being, too hoity-toity or something like that. I mean, if you cut yourself, or if my wife cuts herself, I ask her if she needs a Band-Aid. I know it's a brand name, but at the end of the day, my intended audience, my primary audience, is my wife, who's an English teacher, not a doctor. And so I talk to her like an English teacher. So we talked about that a little bit when we talked about audience in part 1, where you want to make sure that your language and your topic and everything like that are appropriate for the people you're writing for. Same thing with how you would write to a bunch of college students versus how you would write to a bunch of students that were in the first grade. You would talk to a first grader, I hope, very differently than you would talk to a college student. They're on two completely different levels. And so, be conscious of that when you're thinking about, okay, who is this person's intended audience? And sometimes it's very, very simple. Like, for example, if you are listening to, I don't know, let's say, I don't know, Drake puts out a new album. Like, who is Drake's intended audience for a new album that he puts out? I mean, ideally, you would like, as an artist or as a musician or as a writer or whatever it may be, ideally you would want lots of different people to buy your music, because the more people buy your music, the more money you make. But it's not really an acceptable answer to say, like, this is for everyone, or this is for the general public. That's not a specific intended audience. So let's say that, Drake goes out and makes a new album. Well, unless he's trying to do something very experimental, the album is probably going to sound like Drake. So he knows he has a built-in audience of people that like to listen to his style of music. So he's going to sound like himself so that he can sell records to people that are fans of him. And if he gets other people, then great. And we'll get to that in a second. But ideally, you're trying to please your intended audience. So for him, and for a lot of different artists, they are trying to continue to express themselves in a way that their fans would like. It's sort of like, I know a lot of younger people and younger students aren't in the same musical habits that someone like my age would be. Like, I don't download like single individual songs or like stream single individual songs. Like, if an artist puts out an album, I listen to that whole album. To me, that's the point. It's kind of like if you just read one chapter out of a book. It's just not how my brain works. I totally understand and respect people's rights to listen to music that way, but it just doesn't make sense for me. And for a lot of people my age and older, that's just not how they listen to music. But for a lot of people, it is, and that's okay. So if you think about identifying who this target audience is, if you are reading an academic article, or you are reading something that your teacher wrote specifically for her students or his students, then essentially what you have to do is say, okay, the intended audience is students, so they're going to talk or they're going to write in a way that I as a student can understand. So you have to apply that same kind of logic to just about anything. For example, if somebody makes a documentary, so a nonfiction movie versus or television show versus a fictional television show, they're going to have a much more specific audience. So if you take something like Food Incorporated or Food Inc., sometimes people call it, it's about essentially how America mass produces food, especially livestock and agricultural products, with an ever expanding eye towards getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So if you are a consumer, you're going to view the film one way. If you're a farmer or somebody who raises livestock, you're going to be looking at it a completely different way. So the idea behind a documentary is to change people's minds, to influence them to either do something or change their behavior or whatever it might be. So versus something like, I don't know what's coming out right now. You've got like the new Ant-Man and Wasp movie. Well, the intended audience for that is going to be people that are interested in the Marvel universe. So it's one of those things that it's not going to be as specific a target as something like a documentary. Same thing with academic writing versus popular writing. The new Stephen King book is going to be for a much broader intended audience than, say, a report on gerrymandering in Louisiana's southern parishes or something like that. You know, that's going to have a very specific audience, whereas Stephen King is going to go on the bestseller list, and lots of people are from all different walks of life are going to read him. So if it's something popular, it's generally your intended audiences are the fans of that type of medium, and that genre of whatever it is. If it's nonfiction or academic, it's generally going to have a more focused target audience or intended audience. Okay, secondary audience is a lot easier to explain, all right? Secondary audiences are basically anybody that the creator or the writer did not intend to capture the interest of these people, but they did. So the simplest explanation for this, my wife tends to use the example of she's teaching, someone walks past her classroom, finds what she's saying mildly interesting, and hangs out outside to listen to her for a minute or two. All right, so the intended audience in that is her class. She's teaching her students. But if somebody walking by on the outside finds it interesting, that's great. But they're a secondary, or what we call incidental audience. It's not necessarily intended that they have the message, but they may gravitate towards it anyway. My example, basically, now that it's ended, I'm not gonna, don't worry, no spoilers. But my mother, who is, 70, gosh, how old is mom? Mom is 68 years old, and she never watches horror films. She has never seen a zombie movie in her life, not even the original ones from George Romero back in the day. None of it. She's never seen a zombie movie ever. I, on the other hand, love horror and zombie movies, and I love The Walking Dead. My mother also, because of the character development, the pace of the story, all of that stuff, also loves The Walking Dead, which is a shock because definitely not their intended audience. I can tell you very honestly, the intended audience for The Walking Dead, when it first came out 10, 15 years ago, was essentially people like me, like guys in their early 20s to early 40s who liked horror movies, and especially ones with a zombie motif. So because my mom watched a couple episodes when she was visiting my brother and sister-in-law, then she got hooked on it. So she was never intended to be their primary audience because she's way outside the demographic for most of that stuff. But because she happened to get exposed to it and liked it, she becomes a part of the secondary audience. You could say the same thing for Like my wife is not the biggest fan of sketch comedy or anything like that. If you don't know what sketch comedy is, it's like Saturday Night Live, Mad TV back in the day. Whose Line Is It Anyway? If you've ever seen reruns of that. But she loves, loves, loves Weekend Update on Saturday Night Live, and she loves a couple of the sketches they do. She's very much a secondary audience when we watch that show together, because it's just, she isn't that into physical comedy or sketch comedy, and so she would have never been the target audience for a show like that. All right, tone. Tone has to deal with how the message is expressed, and usually there's an emotional component here. So if you were writing about 9/11, you'd have a much more somber tone than, for example, if you were talking about your favorite birthday that you ever had. Those are completely and wildly different things. So the next thing is purpose, and when we take a look at purpose, it refers to what is this trying to accomplish. So basically, it can be almost anything, but there are a few that tend to come back over and over and over again in terms of purposes or themes of a purpose. For example, one might be to entertain. If you're talking about a movie like the Ant-Man movie, or you're talking about something like The Walking Dead, or you're talking about a new album by someone like Drake or Future, or whoever it might be that you're interested in, then the purpose is to entertain. They're just trying to entertain you. Versus when your teacher is up lecturing at the class, or if somebody is making a video on rhetorical analysis, we're trying to educate you. So to entertain, to educate, to persuade, to influence, all of these different things are possible purposes that an author might have. But probably to convince you of something, to entertain you, or to educate you are the three purposes that you're going to come across more than any of the other ones. All right, so when we take a look at contexts, now these are things that you can actually look at and create paragraphs around to help prove what the author's intent was, what their purpose might have been, how effective they are at using the rhetorical strategies in your analysis. So citational has to do with the medium. So what is the medium that they're expressing themselves through? Is it a film? If so, is it fictional or non-fictional? Is it a music download, or if you're really, really ancient, CD or vinyl or something like that? How is it different, basically, having me teach you through a video than sitting in class and listening to a lecture? Is it more personal? Is it distasteful? Does it help you more? Does it help you less? Same thing with music. What is the experience like listening to something, through headphones versus going and seeing someone perform it live? What are those differences? I can tell you very honestly, like, what was it? I think it was last year, for my wife's birthday or for our anniversary. They're really, really close together, so oftentimes I lump them into the same gift. But I got both of us. I'm not the biggest fan in the world, but I like her. But my wife is a big, big, big Billie Eilish fan. And so we got tickets to go see Billie Eilish. They were very expensive tickets, and we were basically up in the nosebleed section. But I can tell you, it's a very different experience listening to her perform live than it is watching one of her videos on YouTube, or listening to it through my iPhone or something like that. It's very, it's just a much more powerful kind of thing. If you've never been to a live music show and kind of felt the speakers make your body vibrate, it's a much different experience than listening to it through, AirPods or whatever. Geographical context is basically, it's similar to the citational, which has to do with the medium. How are you experiencing this? Is it a video? Is it text? Is it live music? Is it recorded music? Blah, blah, blah. Except with geographic context, it has to do with physical location. So that's where you're talking about, are you sitting in a classroom? Are you sitting in your dorm watching a video? Are you sitting in front of the TV watching a travel show about Italy, or are you walking the streets of Rome in person? So the contexts are pretty different there. This one sort of feeds in to this one, but they are two distinct things. Historical context is pretty much what it sounds like. So what is the overall importance of whatever it is you might be viewing or you might be reading in terms of the larger history of, everything from the country to humanity to the world to civilization, whatever it might be. So imagine you were reading a piece comparing COVID, in 2020 to the Spanish flu epidemic 100 years before that. There would be a lot of parallels. And so how does this author or how does this filmmaker or musician try and put their message in a historical context? So, for example, let's see, what would be a good way to describe this? Let me look it up real quick because I'm not going to remember. Okay, so a couple of things come to mind when I was thinking about this initially. One is, I don't know how many of you have ever heard of Beck, the musician. Let's see, what are some of the songs he's done? Loser, let's see, Devil's Haircut was another one. He doesn't really have a genre. He's sort of all over the place, but every couple of years he pops up on the radio. Great musician, one of my favorites. So what he did is, for one of his albums that he released in the last 10 years, he didn't actually record the album. So before radio, before the phonograph, what American families especially, but people did it all over the world, what American families would do is, it wasn't, if you were a musician, you didn't want to sell the most records because there weren't a lot of people with a record player around the year 1900, 1910, 1912, before World War I. And there wasn't radio yet, so you couldn't be played on the radio. So how did you make money as a musician? How did you sell your product? Well, you wrote a songbook. You would actually write the music out and then write the lyrics. If anybody's ever sung in a church choir or anything like that, you know what I'm talking about. You get the little booklet that has the musical notes and then it has the lyrics that go along with it. So for one of his albums, he went way back in time, not literally, and released it as a songbook. So in order to hear the album, you had to be able to play the music and sing, because he never recorded an album to go with it. He just released that songbook. So that could be one thing that you take a look at in a historic sense. Another one would be, if you're familiar with the Wayans brothers, you might know them from, I'm trying to think, In Living Color, or you might know them from the critically underrated movie White Chicks, where they parody white people. But there was a satire that they did called Bamboozled, in which they tried to really shine a light on black minstrel show culture from the vaudeville era, which was very racist and very demeaning towards people of color. But the movie itself uses a lot of historical imagery and situations to make the point that, you know, especially performing in blackface and these exaggerated characters and everything like that, was a symbol of the racism that pretty much has always existed in America, but they did it through a historical lens that was very, very interesting. I don't know how much I would recommend the film. It's rough in places, but it's a wonderful, wonderful example of satire. But it's not for everyone, so just keep that in mind. And sociocultural context is how it fits in to the larger culture of humanity. So what are the different ways that you could relate how the public feels about a particular topic, or what is their energy? Now, it is important to note, especially when you're dealing with something that someone has created that is from a different culture, and that can even happen within the United States. Like, you know, I grew up as a military kid, so my experience was pretty different than a lot of people who never grew up in the military. You know, and so it's hard for people that didn't grow up like that to always understand what I'm talking about certain things. Same thing with, like, if you're really, really, really into, like, Japan, you know, like actual Japanimation, like created in Japan and everything like that, for as much as you love it, that's not your birth culture. It's not what you grew up with. So what you end up with always is cultural bias, which is an inability to fairly evaluate or judge a culture in which you did not grow up. So essentially, you can never fully understand or be part of a culture that you did not grow up in. There will be cultural misunderstandings as you try to translate from one group's experience to your background's experience. It's sort of, if you ever take a history class that deals with colonization and the exploring of the world by Western Europeans, they really had no context to deal with a lot of the native populations that they found throughout the world. If you want a really good example, look at Captain Cook and how he fared against the Hawaiians. It went okay the first time. After that, it didn't go well. But there's this constant evaluating and judging that's going on when you're trying to look at another culture, because the only frame that you have to look through another culture with is the frame you grew up with, which is oftentimes very, very, very different. It's one of the reasons why there are so many misunderstandings with different groups of people all over the world. And you don't even have to go to another country. You can go to a different part of the town you live in, and culturally it will be very different. Or for me, you know, my wife and I are the only white people that live on our particular street. And so culturally, it's really different for the people that have lived and grown up on that street their entire lives versus us who just moved in there, you know, less than a year ago, and we don't necessarily share the same background as some of our neighbors. So there are, I mean, thankfully there haven't been, but you know, that's why oftentimes neighbors have a lot of disputes with each other, because they're coming from two different places. So you can evaluate the context of the original piece or product that you're looking at and kind of base it along the lines of, you know, what is the medium that's being expressed? Geographically, where are you, you know, in the context of experiencing this? What is the greater historical significance? What is the general feeling about this, you know, throughout your area for the majority of people? You know, kind of like most of humanity has a fear of snakes. Not all humanity, but most. That's a shared trait that we have. So you can take a look and evaluate through this, but also pay attention to their tone and the two different types of audiences. And remember, what's the general purpose? Are they trying to entertain you, to educate you, to persuade you? And how are they going about doing that? All right? In part 3, we'll look at an example of some of the ways that you can actually analyze someone's rhetorical strategies. And that should be the end of the rhetorical analysis videos. So will eventually be 3 parts, part 1, 2, and 3. So thank you for watching part 2, and look for part 3 next.